We'll just talk. Dinah Sered, welcome to the Bob's Your Uncle podcast. I've known you for decades, and I was fascinated in meeting your whole family, your brother, your sisters, your mom, dad. Your dad's from Central America, your mom's from South America, but where were you born?
Hi, Bob. Thanks for having me on your show. I'm actually so impressed that you remembered all those details about my large family and what country. My mom is from Colombia. She was born there, and my dad in Guatemala.
And where were you born?
Oh, sorry, that was the question. Yes, I was born in Queens,
New York, New York. Great.
New York.
And you speak a lot of different languages. And I speak a few of English, Australian, American. I speak those three. And we were talking just the other day about our brains and how amazing they are. What processes go when we try to find a word in another language? And we were speaking specifically about what language is your go-to, when your default, if you will, when you're in a brain fog and you're trying to find it. My go-to is Spanish. Even though I'm trying to speak in a Hebrew or speak in sign language or something, I'll hear the word in Spanish, which was like my third language I was learning when I was a kid. You said yours was French, if I remember right, but we talked about the brain process. What did you want to tell me about that? I found it fascinating.
I'm trying to think what book I read this in, or if it was a documentary on how the brain learns languages. A study had been done on teaching kids from different countries and cultures a language that is not their own, that it's not their mother tongue. And what they found that the temporal lobe is what lights up when we start using language and when we start accessing language. For the first 3 years of life, those connections in our brain are made in a certain part of our temporal lobe. After the age of 3, when we begin to learn yet a new language, because within those 3 years, you can have multiple languages that you're learning at the same time. For me, it was English and Spanish. So it lights up this certain part of my brain. Later in life, in high school, in fact, I started learning French, and it also lit up the temporal part of the lobe, but in an overlapping area, distinctly different. So anytime you're learning any additional languages after the age of 3, this other part of your brain starts to light up, which is so interesting. And it completely makes sense when you're learning that 4th or 5th language, that if you're trying to find a word and you're not accessing it, you revert to that secondary language, and a secondary language word will pop up, and so you kind of laugh at yourself and you wonder why, but that's exactly what's happening. So when I was in Israel and I was improving my Hebrew, I would always find French words to add to my Hebrew. So I thought that was very interesting that you also said that you do the same thing when you're trying to find your Hebrew words and accessing Spanish words. So it makes sense.
Bizarre thing. And then you add to that getting older, which is another story altogether, but we're not going to go there today.
Thank you, Bob. I appreciate that.
Early on in our conversations back in the 90s, you were playing flute, and I was recently with you and your husband at your home in the New York area, and you have a piano. You play piano as well. What role does it have a role in your life?
I've always loved music, and as a kid, I would listen to these old Carmen, Carmen, like the Christian singer, and he was very creative in his style. No song was the same, and I would always imagine myself part of his band. In fact, I would continue that imagination where everyone in my family was playing a different instrument on his band, and on tour. And I kind of just always love that idea of playing music together, being part of a team. When the first time I was on campaign, I loved being part of the worship team. That was kind of what started me just having a desire to learn chords. At that point, I was only playing flute when I was 21, first time on in New York City, handing out tracts. We'd have our chapel time, and that was such an encouraging part of my day. The worshiping God together with others that just needed to be filled with God's presence. And so that inspired me to learn to play the piano. I played maybe for 2 years, and I wasn't disciplined enough to continue with the beauty of playing piano in the classical sense. But I picked up chords here and there from people who knew so much better than I did, and loved it. And God used it for his glory. Got to lead worship, lead songs in church in Israel for about 12 years. And I continue to use it here in the New York area, help with Celebrate Recovery on Wednesdays, help with our Sunday worship services from time to time. So it's definitely a big part of my life.
And in fact, when I was staying with you and your family, you were whistling everywhere around the house. I love that because you were hearing music that I didn't hear, and you were participating in that music in your head. It was just great. Yeah. Now you mentioned you lived in Israel for 12 years. Uh, you've moved countries. You took your kids. You have how many children?
We have three, Dinah and I.
And we talked about TCK, third country kids. That's a genre of conversation that most people don't ever even consider. What are your big takeaways from TCK studies that you've conducted or in which you've been learning really since you left the New York area?
Third culture kid, it's a study that I started maybe a few years ago when someone on our staff just desired help with moving families from one country to another. There was a common theme, and stress was one of them, helping having the need to acclimate from one country to another, and helping their kids also to deal with the changes in their world. So I read a book by David Pollock called Third Culture Kids, World Among Worlds. And it was so encouraging to me to know that the things that even I'm a third culture kid. My parents are from two different countries. I was raised in a culture that wasn't from my parents' culture. So there's a mix of cultures. So I felt always very different, and trying to fit in and trying to understand things that were nuanced or part of the culture that was unseen. Uh, the the idea of culture can be thought of as a tree. I've heard it explained as there's the exposed part of the tree, the green leaves, the branches, the trunk of the tree, and then the things that are happening underneath the ground, which are the root systems. And it's those root systems that feed the tree and nourish the tree. And that it could be, your ethics, your morals, your principles that really guide how the tree is going to look like. The trunk, just like it has rings when you slice it horizontally, it has history. And that history is very much part of what the tree has become. The width of the tree and the strength of the tree all comes from all those inner layers of history that has affected the tree. The branches are the government that it lives under, and then the leaves are the expression of the tree, which you could see in its fruit. How the very visible, tangible way a culture is viewed from the outside. So all this is very deep and complex. So if you're placing a child and raising them in one country, uprooting them, just like that metaphor lends itself to, and planting it in a new place, it eventually takes on some of the culture and character and even some of the history of the surrounding culture. So as a third culture kid, it really helped me to understand and help other parents that are guiding their families through this culture change. As one who's experienced it, but also now has more language to be able to share those frustrations and excuse me, facilitate that that transition, because it is a transition from one mindset to another mindset and take that on.
The
So that
world,
was really,
oh, go ahead, sorry.
sorry. No, that's okay. That's okay.
Well, I think
Finish.
the world is shrinking. I remember when my wife and I were in Thailand with our youngest, and we were just walking in a little village far away from Bangkok, and every little shop in the middle of the day was manned by, I would say, a young woman, a teenager maybe. And each one of those shops, whether it was a clothier or a food shop or whatever, they had a television on and MTV was in the background. So here they are in this far, far away place where they spoke Thai, they ate Thai food, everything was monocultural, but it was being infected by the
Mm,
the language of American music, television, pop music, and its commensurate cultures that were
mm,
clashing with their home base culture. So I can understand that because of the effect of media. But then there's lots of other situations. I mean, you describe it well that you grew up there in New York and you had Central American, South America, and people outside of those mm, understandings would say, "Oh, well, they're all Spanish." You know,
mm.
so that's just Spanish culture, and you spoke Spanish. Did you speak Spanish at home?
We did.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Uh, you
Although there's Spanish from Colombia, Spanish from Guatemala, there's a difference in language and syntax.
Oh, and jokes. I remember being in Mexico City with pastores from Argentina and Guatemala, from Mexico, from all over the Latin American world. And every night, though I speak Spanish, my head was spinning with pain because everybody was speaking with their own dialect and their
Mm,
jokes were dialectical. And I couldn't do it. And
mm.
I realized my own limitations. You lived in Israel. You still have an Israel thinking going on. Your daughter served in the IDF. When you watch what's happened in the world since the 7th of October, given your history, your culture, all those things in your tree imagery, do you have hope for the world in which we live?
Absolutely. I definitely do. And even looking past October 7th at especially Jewish history and how things look pretty dismal. It looked like all hope was lost. And from different corners of God's perfect plan, he found a way of escape for salvation of Jewish people. If we think about the Holocaust, I mean, if Hitler were allowed to have continued, who knows how many more loss of lives. And so we know because God has been faithful in the past during the Spanish Inquisition, during so many pogroms in Eastern Europe. We're just so thankful that God is still sovereign and He does not allow for His people to be uh, will never allow His people to be completely destroyed because of God's faithfulness. He's promised, He's made promises to Abraham. He will fulfill those promises until Jesus Himself is on the throne, reigning from Jerusalem. So we do have hope. In what way God will help in this situation that's happened after October 7th, we have yet to find out, but we have people all over the world that love God, that love God's people, that love Israel, and are calling out to God in prayer for sustaining the people in Israel. We have believers that are serving in the country and also feeling the weight and effects of war and civil unrest. And so I would encourage those that are hearing to pray for the believers that are in Israel, that they would be empowered by God's Spirit to bring that hope that is tangible, it is real. And he provides light and encouragement for all those who put their trust in him. Just yesterday, I was hearing a testimony of a Jewish believer who had a hard upbringing, was into the occult. And at some point, the Lord presents himself to her in a very real and visible way, and saw Jesus himself. And she said to herself, no, it can't be. It can't be. And she set it aside for a moment, but she was in such a state, she had spiraled downward and downward, and she saw that she had no other hope. And she went on her face and said, Jesus, you are who you say you are. Please forgive me of all the wrongs I have done and help me. And immediately her life, she said that she felt her life coming out of darkness into light. It was such a stark transformation that she experienced. And she realized that if she hadn't been in such a dark place, she wouldn't have sensed that wonderful light that she did when she gave her life and heart to the Lord. So yes, I do have hope that God is reaching out to Israelis in Israel and to those of us that are here with biting our nails sometimes at the things that we're seeing. But instead of being anxious for God says in his word not to be anxious for anything, but in everything with prayer and supplication, make your requests known to God. And the peace of God that surpasses all understanding will guard our hearts and minds in Christ Jesus. So there is hope in whatever situation that we find ourselves in Israel. There is hope because God is on the throne. He has faithful love towards us and towards his people. And I'm just prayerful, anticipating God to be on the move, and for us to continue interceding and interacting with what God is already at work in Israel and among his people.
It's beautiful. Thank you. Your hope is not based on handshakes or treaties. You lived in Israel. You know that treaties last as long as the ink is wet, and then that's it. But, you know, there are a lot of people listening globally. I've interviewed some on the show who have this binary view of if you're pro-Israel, you're anti-Arab. And if you're pro-Arab, you're anti-Israel. You can't be pro both. Can you be pro Arab people and like you are committed to the God of the Jewish people, the God of the Bible? Can you be for the other guys?
Absolutely. I believe that you can be pro-Arab, pro any culture, in fact. God loves people. He died so that people can know him and be rescued from darkness and death and in eternal separation from God. And like this woman that I mentioned, to be transferred into the kingdom, from the kingdom of darkness into the kingdom of light. And anybody who loves God will love people because people were created in God's image. And he has a heart to see not one particular people saved, but he came that all people might be saved. In fact, that's why we have a Jewish people at all. He desired that this people would be his special people, a testimony of God's faithfulness on earth, a people that would live their lives committed to him. And so that is amazing that God would do that in the first place, and that God would send his son Jesus so that not only can the Jew receive Jesus as their Messiah, but that all people can know and enjoy that fellowship with God restored again. So he did that he brought Jesus to the Jewish people so that the Jewish people would announce the Messiah to the whole world. Now, has that completely been fulfilled in the intent which God meant it? Not fully, but I believe that it does happen. Bob, you are a Jew for Jesus. You love the Lord, and you are a wonderful testimony of God's faithfulness to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as you share the gospel to whoever happens to be in front of you. And it's a wonderful testimony to hear the gospel coming from someone who is from the line of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and can say, yes, God has been faithful to our people. He's been faithful to me. And because of his faithfulness, I can share this wonderful, wonderful gospel news of salvation to anyone who will listen.
It's the best story ever.
Mhm.
Dinah, it's great to catch up. Thank you. My guess is this is going to become a dual episode. So thank you for giving me so much data to share with my audience, and people will be benefited from hearing and learning with you. Is there anything else you'd like to share with our global audience?
Well, as a global audience, number one, thank you for hearing me out in the greater New York area. I'm just so thankful that there's people that are loving to hear about things that are happening all over the world, and desiring to be a part of what God is doing in different parts of the world. So thank you for listening, and thank you, Bob, for having me on your podcast.
Dina, you're a joy. Blessings on you, your good husband, and those three beautiful children. Keep going, keep sharing what you know to be true. And I can't wait to hear you whistle again. All the best.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you, Bob. God bless.